the University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.
Okay, folks, so today is chapter 2 of navigating your academic journey. And in this, we will discuss the context within which we operate and also your career strategy and how do you actually blend the two in order to get that coveted full professorship. And last time we spoke about the different levels and so on. So what I'll do initially is just to very briefly reflect on what we have done so far, and then we'll continue with today's kind of session. So as I've already mentioned, there's always a broader context within which things happen. And then secondly, you need to strategize within that particular environment. And there are a couple of really basic rules of the game that you need to understand. And because the promotion doesn't just happen, it has to be strategized and strategized well ahead of time. And it doesn't have to take hundreds of years. Well, hundreds is a bit of an exaggeration, but I have seen people being promoted from AP to P within 2 years because of their very, very clever planning. So anything is possible. It's pretty much the ball is in your hands. But now, what are the rules of the game? So once again, just like to emphasize that a great career strategy is based on multiple strengths. And it's not just one thing that counts. In the last conversation that we've had, you mentioned that you often feel that it's only research all the way. And then in our conversation, we also heard that different universities have got different approaches. And yes, research certainly plays a role, but so does teaching and learning. And teaching and learning has become a very specialized area, as well as your internal and external academic citizenship and leadership. So the key thing is, imagine that your talents are a fleet of ships, and you have to navigate your talents through a pretty turbulent environment in what's happening in terms of the world, in terms of competition, in terms of positioning yourself as an intellectual, as a scholar. And actually your job is to make sure that all of your talents are heading in the same direction and will eventually end up at the same harbor. So let's have a look at our operating environment. I've covered 3 areas last time. The first one was global and continental, and then at your own universities. And I think what is always great, is to draw 3 concentric circles and to see who's your network, who's kind of local people that you kind of work with and to fulfill your strategy, who in the continent and who at the global level. And the key thing is there's more and more kind of opportunity now to address global questions and key issues. So this is just in short what we discussed the last time. And the question that I've asked you was, what legacy will our generation of associate and full professors leave? And to that point, I have shared with you the number of professors in the country and associate professors, and it's actually a very small number. And what is more concerning is that a large proportion of our professoriate in the country are kind of on the verge of retiring, having about 5 or less years left. So what kind of legacy will we leave? And I think an essential part that you have identified in our conversation is that, we are also part of our responsibility, our social responsibility, is to develop the new generation of professors as well. And so far, it seems to me as though you've had a great conversation on all of this. So the next point was that, strategy is strategy. Whether you run a corporate, whether you are involved in university work or an NGO, a strategy remains a strategy. And there are 5 basic things that always needs to be remembered. And the reason why I choose to identify 5 key aspects of strategy is because it gives me one for every finger. It's kind of then easier for me to remember. So the first one is beginning having the end in mind. I'm sure this is a phrase that you've already heard. And to actually execute a strategy is not that easy. Sometimes things go a bit rough. Sometimes it works absolutely in your favor when opportunity comes along, and sometimes you just have to overcome obstacles. But what is your big picture? What is it that you'd like to achieve? And this is something that you have to I always find that writing down my thoughts on a notepad really makes a lot of sense. And from that, you can figure out what is it that you'd like to get done. And then the second one is, where are you now? And then obviously, then you'll see that there's a gap almost between from where you would like to be and where are you now. And that is the gap that has to be filled. And the important thing then is to figure out, but what are the 3 or 5 maximum big things that I need to get done? And I think in terms of promotion, for me, the 3 big things that stand out, obviously, the first one would be your teaching and learning competence, or otherwise in promotions terms, also known as your teaching portfolio. And I will speak to that a little bit later. And then the next one would be your research portfolio. And it's not just about pumping numbers. It is especially about the impact of your work as well, especially if you move into the professoriate. And then thirdly is about your service within your university setup, within your faculty, within your department, and then also externally. So now the next thing is you can't get things done on your own. So you need certain resources. And from what I've gathered from your feedback is the time is what you have least of. And then obviously to build a research portfolio also requires funding. Now, the level of funding varies from discipline to discipline. For example, in the sciences, you are pretty dependent on heavy equipment and expensive equipment and laboratories, whereas in the social sciences, we actually pretty much depend on databases and respondents and so on, and our international networks. So resources include time, yes, but it also requires a network and the people who could assist you and support you in achieving your career goals. Then the next one is, once you figured out the resources, it's important to get a sense of how you are progressing. And so it's good to, every term, to look back and say, well, how well have I progressed with my 3 big goals or my maximum 5 big goals? And actually, do I need to adjust course? Have I actually invested enough time in this? And I know this is difficult because many of us, well, actually, I think all of us in some other way have some other caring responsibility as well. And we saw that during lockdown as well, and especially nowadays that we have major economic challenges. So how do we adjust course? How do we stay on course? And that is pretty much part of the thing. And then eventually, it's important to give your journey a name. And what comes to mind, and this is something that we spoke about previously, so I'm not going to repeat myself, is that basic SMART principle that we use in goal setting. And the S representing specific. That means not waffling, but really narrowing down and to be able to write it in one sentence. It needs to be measurable so that you can monitor and evaluate yourself. Then A is for achievable, and it's realistic. And then finally, time bound, because you need to put a clear time frame to it so that you don't get disappointed at the end. So with that in mind, we also had a conversation about the different levels of promotion, starting out as a lecturer, becoming a senior lecturer, which basically this is where you enter the system. And what we shared last time was to get a lecturer and to get into the academic world can be a rude awakening. because it's changed tremendously, I'd say, over, well, I've been around for a while, but I think universities normally change in the order of about 3 to 5 years. You can actually see the progress, or the opposite of progress for that matter. So there are a whole range of new skills that you have to master in order to get familiar with the system. And then you become a senior lecturer. Senior lecturer means when you've got your doctorate, and when you've acquired all the skills, you know how departments work, you know how programs work, you have taught various modules, you know how to adjust it, you know how to work with a very diverse range of students. You've been involved in departmental citizenship. So, and then you become an associate professor. Now, entering the professoriate means that you've especially mastered the postgrad portfolio. And that means that you know how to supervise, or that you are co-supervising, that you're working with seasoned academics. And it's almost as though you're looking back from a distance and see there's a unique kind of tree starting to grow in the forest of academia. And then finally, at the top of the list, or the food chain for that matter, would be becoming a full professor. And a full professor means that you are well established, that the world recognizes your work, and that you also have got a network, a sustainable network around you of postgraduates and research actions. And it could take in many areas. I see more and more, for example, that the scholarship of teaching and learning is rapidly emerging. Lots of work is being done on this. So there's ample opportunity there to really grow into a full professor. Now, that is a very short kind of summary of what we have discussed. And I've asked you, what is the profile of an associate professor and a professor? And it was very interesting to hear how your views kind of triangulated. Good. So let's start today with some observations on professorial key performance indicators. Now, key performance indicators is a term that's used in talent management, and it basically means you get key performance areas, and those are the three big ones, which I've listed there: teaching, research, academic citizenship, and leadership. And then those are broken down into smaller bits and pieces, so which may help you to guide yourself and to identify your targets and what you'd like to achieve and by when you'd like to do it. So the first one is your teaching portfolio. A teaching portfolio is perhaps for many of us who are not in the humanities a very difficult thing to consider or to kind of write, because it's really reflective. You have to think about not just how much you are doing, but how are you doing it, and what works and what doesn't work. So it's important that you realize that you as a, let me use the word teacher. It's a word that I really like. What kind of teacher are you? And there are different styles of teaching, and it's important that we get familiar with this. When I had to write my teaching portfolio a couple of decades ago, I thought, oh my word, what is this all about? It's totally out of my field. But just by understanding and reading about different ways of teaching was very enriching. I could actually refine my own technique. Then the second one is you need to keep a record of your teaching endeavors. And it's interesting when you look at those notes and your evaluations of your teaching effectiveness, that means your student feedback, which is normally consists out of two elements. The one is a basic matrix in which rating is done, and it's normally done electronically. And then what is really interesting is the narrative part where students comment. And then you realize that you are good in some things, but you are really bad at other things as well. So, and we learn more from the constructive feedback that we get in the things that we haven't really succeeded in. And there are many ways in which you can work at that. I've already spoken to teaching effectiveness. So then the materials demonstrating your teaching. So how do you teach? Is it just death by PowerPoint? Do you have a learning guide? Do you have case studies? How do you use online? And online is pretty much part of our endeavors nowadays. But there's a huge difference between online and blended learning, or a hybrid model, whichever way you'd like to call it. And this needs to become clear in your teaching portfolio. And then obviously different activities are available to improve your instruction. And each person has got a very individual style to engage. And obviously it's not just you who have to teach, but I often use a lot of alumni in my teaching. One of the things that my students, especially at postgrad level, like is when I invite an industry expert or two, or one or two of my former students to form like a panel, and then we have a discussion that day. And obviously I know what kind of questions I'd like to have answered or to be explored, but there are many ways in which you can make this really interesting. And then there are contributions to teaching at your university. You are never an island if you are an academic. You can't afford to isolate yourself. And it's important to hear from other people, from other faculties. Now, this morning, Marty spoke about her being a law expert, or expert in international law. And I'm sure that, if you have an informal conversation, that you'll pick up, well, this is an interesting way of thinking. And then you ask, well, how do you bring that message over to your student? What kind of techniques do you use? And then the learning starts to take place. So Megan has also told me yesterday that there's a whole session on writing a teaching portfolio as well coming up. And I think you will probably gain more depth in that part. But also it's important that your faculty emphasizes this aspect and bring people together to share their ideas. Okay, so here comes the one which we're all pretty familiar with, and this is your research portfolio. Now, every year, your university submits research output units, and it's a massive schlep nowadays. I do realize that, because you have to capture the output. It has to be audited internally, and all kinds of questions are asked about the validity and reliability of your publications, your conference papers, your books and book chapters, but it's kind of, you just have to work through that pain. So what is also a good practice within a department or within a faculty is to have people who can take that administrative load of uploading those research outputs into the system. Then the next thing is your impact. And research impact basically means who reads your work and who builds your ideas into their own research. And this means that you need to kind of read pretty widely and see what new things and new ideas you can bring into your portfolio. And eventually, this results in citations. And we can see this on Scopus, or we can see this on Google Scholar. Google Scholar is like a wide net, it casts wide, and that's why the citations and the H indices are normally higher when compared to Scopus. But what is really interesting in Scopus is the field-weighted citation indices. And that gives you an idea of how do you compete with the rest of the world. A field-weighted citation index of 1 would mean that you are on par with other researchers in your field in the world. If it's a 1.2, it means that you are 20% above the average. If it's a 0.8, it means that you are performing about 20% under the global average. And then you have the NRF rating, which I believe that you've had a conversation with Prof Stella yesterday. And the important part of that is, I don't think the monetary value of being rated is much. It's about 50,000 Rand a year. But what is of real value is the peer evaluation that you go through. And I'm sure that Prof Stella has also emphasized that you need to kind of see the river running through your work. What is your contribution? And as in the preparation of a M proposal or a doctoral proposal, you need to kind of demonstrate width, but especially depth. And depth is almost like a diamond. And then your contribution comes through, and then you get a rating accordingly. Then postgrad output is also important, and not how many you supervise, how many you have completed successfully. And that is kind of why this is probably I found it one of the more difficult skills to master. So I've started supervising honors and co-supervising masters, and eventually I've identified people who are really good. And I've worked with them, and I've learned, it's almost like an apprenticeship. I've learned the rules of the game. And otherwise you get so involved with your students that you might be either overbearing or start to take the thinking away from them. And actually it's a total different level of developing competencies. Then obviously grants are also becoming increasingly important because universities clearly, our subsidies are not nearly what they were a couple of years ago. And research is a very expensive business. If you just think about the cost of seeing a doctorate through, and the cost is not just money, it's also the time that it takes and the preparedness of your students. And grants are becoming more and more important. And it's very seldom that I see that future researchers get a massive grant on their own, unless you're a Saatchi chair. But even so, there's normally Saatchi chairs work with many other informed and acknowledged researchers, and together they compete for big grants. But once again, the thing goes into the planning side. Plan together, say this is your big project that you're going to apply for. It could easily be 3 to 4 universities working together, and then you are more likely to succeed because your strength then is weighed in terms of the strength and your previous output. Then the last one is academic citizenship and leadership, which speaks for itself, and we broadly divide this into 2 components. To put it very straightforwardly, internal means everything that happens within the borders of your university. That would be your faculty's research committee, your ethics committee, your teaching and learning committee, your program working group, everything that happens within the fences of your university. External means your involvement in your industry and in your scholarly networks. For example, being a chair of a work group or international work group, a community action that you have coordinated, and so on. So I think what is really important is often seen that, and I think I've mentioned this the last time, that sometimes people get so involved in academic citizenship and leadership that they totally neglect, let's say, the research part or the teaching part. But roughly, I would say that you need to spend about 2/3 of your time on the teaching portfolio and your research portfolio and decide which one of those are really your strengths, and then about 1/3 of your time on academic citizenship and leadership. So that is more or less, it obviously varies from university to university, but that would be the broad guideline. Okay, so just a few pointers towards success that I'd like to repeat. Get familiar with the rules of the game before you get on the field. So what is really important is even before you start to plan, be familiar with your university's promotions policy and procedure. Every university has got a policy or should have a clear policy on what it takes to be promoted and some of the broader criteria. And the university's criteria are then taken to the faculties, and every faculty, according to the disciplines that it serves, follows the broad strategy and then defines what they would consider as a professor or an associate professor in their fields. And what really helps a lot, and this is something that I often do in talent management within the unit that I'm responsible for, is to bring the associate and full professors who were recently promoted in touch with folks who want to get promoted. And I think that kind of exchange of learning experiences from different disciplines really makes one hell of a difference at the end of the game. But please do understand the rules of the game before you engage. Okay, so folks, now we can start with today's conversation. And my first question to you is, we spoke about the broader, bigger world of academia, the world itself. And as an associate professor and eventually as a professor, you have to position yourself in this big world. Now, how would you fit into the bigger world of global academia? I would like you to spend about 10 minutes on this, and then we can, in our breakaway rooms, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then I'll share some ideas with you. How does that sound? So let's hear, who can speak on behalf of the first group on how do you fit into this great world of academia? How do you see it?
Oh, okay, all right. Though we ran out of time, but I've taken some few ideas on what we have discussed. We've indicated that we believe we do fit in the bigger picture globally because we are eager to transfer skills, and we also publish and also wish to continue publishing the ideas that leads to innovative developments. We also indicated that we are in a position to encourage, especially those of us who are females, to encourage other females to follow research in academia. One of us, Smata, I think, who said she's in law, which is a male-dominated discipline. So by her presence, and she can be able to encourage more of the females to follow the field of law. And also, we indicated that we are knowledge consumers, and also so we can be able to advance globally. We also, some of us, which includes Jeremiah and myself, we are water-based. Yes, thank you, Mother, for that. We are water-based researchers. So where we carry experiments to find pollutants that are present in our water, and also to find ways to treat those pollutants within our water for water purification, which water is a global problem. So we do believe that we are doing so much, and we still have so much to do in order to contribute towards the bigger picture globally. So Bazani can add something from our group.
Yes, my point. Good morning, everyone. Swapping.
Hello,
Yes, my point is that the other one, we fit because we are the people. Oh, I don't want to mention myself. We are the people who provide the new strategic methods for understanding the concept. So if you remember in the past, if you read the book, we couldn't find the people or the lecturers that define the concepts more clearer. So in this globalization, we should be the people who make it clear, so that it will be easier for people to love the cause that you teach. So that's what I can add. Thanks.
Thank you, Toko. I will definitely explore your thoughts a little bit. Anybody else from the team would like to add? Okay, so let's go to group number 1.
I'm sorry, colleagues, I got kicked out. I've just joined again. It's load shedding.
Bunyana, I'm so glad that you're back. Okay, so let's go to group two. We just spoken to group two, had feedback from group two. So let's go to group one.
So in our group one, we kind of discussed what is actually what does global citizen mean? Because I think we often think that Africa is probably excluded from that global citizen. So if we think of ourselves as contributing to world knowledge or global knowledge, whatever that we're doing within our own context is contributing to world knowledge. So it's not that whatever happens in Africa is not part of that contributing to world knowledge. And we also realize that there are so many things that one does that contributes to world knowledge, for example, or to global citizenship, in a sense that, if you examining thesis for other people, or if you're reviewing manuscripts for other people, or for journals, or reviewing grants or whatever it is, that is contributing to global knowledge, and so in a way you are a global citizen in that sense. But I think what we did agree a lot on was that context, local context, we often forget that local context is very important, and that, if you're creating knowledge in Africa, it doesn't mean that that knowledge is only consumed in Africa. People in other parts of the world also learn from that knowledge. So in a way, that makes you a global citizen, because you're creating things that other people in other parts of the world don't see. So I think that was the main discussion.
That's a very strong point. I will definitely elaborate on this and share with you, with the team, kind of some ideas on how you can actually accelerate that process, and how we can actually position our continent better. Any other ideas? Okay, so in that case, I will kind of comment on what I've heard so far. The interesting thing is, first, Precious, I think you said, or somebody mentioned here, that you've run out of time. So it's actually amazing how rich these conversations become when we start to talk to each other about our broader thoughts of academia and where do we fit in. So there's a lot of cross-pollination that can very easily happen, provided that people continue to talk to each other. So it's always good to have an open mind. Precious, you've mentioned a very important point, and this is the further engagement with more women. I still think that women generally, when I look at universities' research output, should be enabled and empowered to contribute more. So it's also great to have women to look up as role models. And it's great to see that there's such a good representation of women in this particular group. Secondly, there's something that I want you to, Precious, I was wondering if you could unpack this a little bit more. You've mentioned that we are knowledge consumers. Could you maybe just elaborate a little bit on this? Because I'd like to hear what kind of angle you take on the topic.
Okay, can we give it, Jeremiah, can you please help in unpacking us a bit, please?
All right, yes, thank you. I mentioned, I think during our session, that we've got I call it a KCCB model, that we refer to knowledge creator, knowledge consumer, and knowledge broker. In this case, yes, that's basically how we fit into the bigger picture. We immensely contribute in terms of the knowledge creation through our different fields of specialization. Also through, problem solving, we then create a knowledge which we share with the science communities or any other community out there in terms of the publications. That's the part of creating the knowledge. But also when we work with communities around us in dealing with challenges that are facing communities, it doesn't basically end there. We solve these problems and then we then provide the solution. And at the end, we have publications out there for people and for generations to come to continue to read. And that way, it's in line with the knowledge creation. But also we learn from other people how they solve other challenges that they are confronted with. In that case, we are on the other side of the coin where we become the knowledge consumers. And we learn really from the past generations of professors how they were basically doing things. And in a modern society, how we should take things forward as a new professors or FPP participants in the 21st century university environment, how we should do things differently going forward. So in that regard, we have learned a great deal of solutions and strategies, how we really have to deal with things. And lastly, how we disseminate this, I already touched on it. It's through the platforms of publishing. We have so many platforms nowadays, including Scopus, how we basically disseminate the information. So I think that's part of really being the knowledge creators, knowledge consumers, and knowledge brokers.
Okay,
I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it certainly does. So thank you for that contribution. I think what I took from your observations there is there was a comment made in the chat box that reading and using others' knowledge is part of being a knowledge consumer. And I think the one aspect that you brought to the fore, which I think is incredibly important, is knowledge brokerage, meaning that you actually actively distribute or disseminate your knowledge. You spread the word, you spread the fact that you are participating in a particular field and contributing so that others can grow from there, but also work with you in order to deepen your knowledge. I think that's an absolutely valuable point. And I especially see this in the field of information knowledge management and data science, which have moved really closely together. Because I think broadly, we found ourselves now, if I think about the field of marketing management, in the past, the researchers were always looking for data in order to figure out what's happening. Nowadays, it looks to me as though the data is looking for the researchers in order to make sense of more and more complexity. So that for me is a very interesting shift, which I currently observe. You've also mentioned, I want to go back to what Precious has mentioned on behalf of your group, the Sustainable Development Goals. There is a tremendous intensification of the Sustainable Development Goals, and actually most of the ranking systems have now also picked up on the sustainability goals, and there are all kinds of rankings taking place in terms of our worldwide contribution. So this is clearly adding a lot. So it's worthwhile to check those out and to see how your work relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. Then new strategies, new insights. And I think also part of that strategy is, especially in terms of positioning yourself as a global expert, is how do you share those insights? And there's a couple of very basic things that you could do, like being registered on CIBAR, having an ORCID number, code number, and add it to your email. You could, for example, add to your email address at the bottom, where you kind of your name and your designation stands. You could add your latest publications, all little things that people can click on immediately and become more aware of what you do. And it's interesting how well these basic small little things work. Interestingly, we've used the word global a couple of years ago, and then the new term that came out, let's say, and it was used over the last decade, was the word glocal, a combination of global and local. And now I see that continental has also come into the story. Now, talking about the continent, I think there's a great deal of very exciting research happening within the continent, especially in terms of sustainability, industrial policy, economic development. And what I'll show to you now when we have our discussion is just how this whole thing fits together. And there are many scholars from Africa who find themselves in leading international positions now, and especially within universities. And it's great to touch base again with those. And also, they will immediately, because many of their doctorates are occupying senior positions within the continent to executive positions. And as always, this is a very important network to link into to boost your research. So definitely a role to play, but now the key thing is how do you get the job done? So let's have a look at a basic case. And what I'd like to share with you now is a field that I have a personal interest in. So this is kind of something that I know something about. And this is kind of what's happening within the broader world of academia. Now, the interesting thing is many people write things about universities and how they operate and how they're changing. So I think the core principle for me is that if you are a co-author, an author or a co-author within an internationally published journal, it reflects that you have an international network. So that's pretty much something that people consider when they rate your work and the impact of your work. So getting as early as possible into co-authorships with internationals really is worthwhile. And it starts off with very, very basic interactions at a conference level. It could be a Zoom call or an MS Team call. It could be that you write an email to a researcher and ask whether you can spend 20 minutes with them online to discuss their work. But you need to reach out. Nobody's going to come to you. You need to reach out. And I can't think, I've actually had, normally the great people in the world and the really great intellectuals always provide time to engage with others. So interestingly, from 98 to 2018, some 9,000 international work papers on higher education matters were published. And when you analyze this, they focused on 13 journals. So you see, it's pretty specialized and very competitive. But what I also found interesting is that the leading authors and co-authors were either in the USA, the UK, and Australia. And nowadays, we see that many of the emerging authors and co-authors, let's say people who started to publish over the last 3 to 5 years, are now from China and Germany. So the original papers had a very strong theoretical base, which was grounded on the policies of a couple of European countries, or the UK and their previous colonies. And there was actually, it was more theoretical, but very little organizational systems or country analysis. Now, this I found strange because when you think about policymakers across the world, always emphasizes cross-national comparisons on the role of universities. So I think my key point is that the way in which we generate knowledge and we disseminate this and how we broker it has changed a lot over the last 3 to 5 years. And I think there's ample opportunity there. But let me illustrate and show you a graph of this. So this is all the papers about what is happening in one country. All of these, and it's almost an exponential growth lately since 2008. Great papers and more competitive papers involve at least 2 countries. And that extends our possibility of discovery, or Jeremiah, as you said, kind of, we generate new knowledge, which we then share with the rest of the world. And great researchers are always looking for opportunities to duplicate methodology and to involve other countries as well, because it just makes the work far more competitive. I've seen this in the field where I work in, which is organizational development, management theory and practice, especially economics, you name it, data science. This is where the competitiveness comes in. And if people know that you are living in the continent or in this country, or that you are close to neighboring countries, or that you have networks within the continent, there's quite an eagerness to work with you. So this is clearly happening, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity now emerging to build that network. But again, I'd like to emphasize that the network has to be built. It doesn't come to you. We don't just fall into it. It requires strategy. So once you've figured out what is it that you'd like to get done and what kind of professor you'd like to be, build those bridges and see how many other countries you can get involved. And it's actually, it happens faster than you think. And quite soon you will realize that your opportunities exceed yourself, and that you actually need to start to narrow it down and decide which ones are really best for you. Once again, let's think about the diversity of work being published now. There you can clearly see this little blue one here gives you an indication of the number of papers being published on systems. And obviously it takes a more kind of a theoretical approach. Then there's a huge increase in the actual impact between a system, let's say the Southern African system, or Pan-Africanism for that matter, and the organizations within this. And then still the majority are written on the individual experience within a particular, a very narrow location. But this area, again, is growing. And there you can see how the diversity has increased if you express this as a diversity index. So once again, remember the fact that you are a new researcher or an upcoming researcher means that you are looking at things with a fresh mind. And we sometimes feel that we shouldn't ask those questions that we have in the back of our minds. And it might just be that you hear somebody else asking that exact same question. And just because that is a very knowledgeable or a seasoned researcher, then you think to yourself, my goodness, why haven't I asked that question? So it takes a lot of courage to stand up and ask your questions and to connect. But that is a skill that you have to acquire, and it will serve you well for the rest of your academic life. Another point that I'd like to stress here is multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity. Because in the competitive environment in which we are now operating, good universities are clearly separated from great universities in terms of their understanding of these 3 approaches to research. So let's start with the first one, multidisciplinarity. So let's say that you are, and I'm going to use an example of a field which is more familiar to me. Let's say that you are all in the Department of Business Management. So this is pretty much like an income degree, coursework degree, where you focus on real world issues And then eventually you publish in journals, but nobody else really takes notice of this. And the moment that it start to evolve in terms of very short-term projects and some international partnerships, but it's still pretty theoretical, with a little bit of practice combined with it. And it could be that somebody in business management works with somebody in logistics. Then the next phase of the evolution is interdisciplinarity. Now, once again, this is when you start to look at not just what's happening in Johannesburg or in Cape Town or KZN, but you start to think, but what are the big issues in the world? And how can we actually not just resolve this problem in the short term, but how can we really contribute towards humanity? And how can we take this big problem and break it down into different areas? This is now, for example, where the guys in the Department of Data Science and Applied Information Systems would start to work with the guys in information knowledge management, and then logistics, and maybe another department in the Faculty of Science on ecology, for that matter. So this is where interdisciplinary research kicks in, and it's kind of far more competitive than just multidisciplinary work. So transdisciplinarity is almost like the big one, and it takes a while to get this going. This is kind of where you contribute stuff that has never existed before. This is normally where researchers from different fields that were formerly unknown to each other start to work together and come up with whole new ideas and processes to serve humanity to the better. Now, what is interesting here is that both interdisciplinarity and especially transdisciplinarity takes a huge amount of really advanced intra and interpersonal skills. And intra means that you need to know who you are, and interpersonal skills is your relationship to others, with others. So your human skills, your skills as a person who builds bridges among different disciplines become really important. So that is why it's also important in forging your career. It's not just to get stuck in your department, but to really reach out. If you hear somebody delivering an interesting talk, I've had, for example, conversations. I know nothing of philosophy. Well, within my field, a little bit. But a person that I've had great conversations with about things that I've got no idea what it's about is, for example, at the University of Pretoria, formerly UJ, is Prof Daneel van Lill, because the way in which he thinks and asks questions is very different compared to the way that I would think. And that kind of leads to many kind of really interesting conversations. And I see, Marty, you spoke about law earlier. I see more and more conversations happening between the law faculty and other disciplines, because let's think about the world of data science. And the key question then is, who generates the data? And to whom does it belong? And to what purpose? Where's the whole area of ethics come in? And then on the other side is where the humanities kick in is, how do we actually empower society to be tech savvy? Otherwise, we are bombarded with information and somebody else is going to make up your mind before you can make up your own mind. So this gives you an idea of how the evolution of thinking and the evolution of research. And ideally, when you are in the professoriate, you should have moved from, obviously your base lies in multidisciplinarity, because this is where you are taught the first rules of the game. But interdisciplinarity is pretty much at the core of it. Okay, so a couple of years ago, we've asked ourselves when we defined the College of Business and Economics here at UJ's research strategy. Well, how do we actually get this done? How do we move from multidisciplinarity to interdisciplinarity and then transdisciplinarity? And I've lately seen 2 or 3 papers coming out from our side, really starting to touch on transdisciplinarity in the field of management. And actually, this comes from critical thinking and other aspects that goes with this. But the questions that in terms of progress, we've moved from publishing or contributing about 145 research output units in 2017. And last year, we submitted successfully 607 research output units. So roughly that translates in about 1,800 research outputs. But this didn't happen overnight. It was once again strategy, strategy, strategy. And we had a workshop about 6 years ago. And a workshop for us is that we kind of asked questions, and then we, about a group of 200 academics, brainstormed this thing, and we captured this in the feedback in real time and electronically, and we analyzed this. And these were eventually the questions that guided us most. So the fact that you need to ask yourself, what you need to ask yourself is, could your research output benefit from one or more of these approaches? And what are the barriers and obstacles within your discipline that prevent cross-departmental collaboration? And I think what may come to mind is that you sometimes get people who are pretty much they always want to operate on their own. But you'll find in contrast that the professors in your university that are really moving ahead are people who've reached out and has a wide network on which they kind of rely. And normally as well, they're not full of nonsense and they're always willing to share. But once again, you need to reach out. So are there opportunities for collaboration in your research to bring that new spark into it? Okay, so colleagues, we've covered the part on where do you fit into the global arena. And the interesting thing about a global arena is, in summary, okay, now I want to share a story with you, or a metaphor. You know, you get 3 kinds of players. The first group that you get is the Olympic team. Now, whenever one of our sports teams perform well, or whenever we see an Olympic athlete performing exceptionally well, we all feel so excited, you know, wow. And we almost feel as though we could associate with their wonderful skills, and we admire them. Well, the fact of the matter is you're never next to them in the pool in the mornings, 5 o'clock when they start to exercise, or late at night in the gym. So if you want to play in the Olympic League, everybody's interested in your CV and the stuff that you're doing, but nobody cares a damn about your pain. Then the second league is where we get together, we throw the ball, hit the ball, whatever the ball, have a couple of beers afterwards, but nothing really happens. That's called the social league. And then the third league, and this is the predominant league, are the spectators. Now, they've paid 300 or 400 Rand for a ticket, and they've bought the right to criticize from the stands, but they never get on the field. And there's no right or wrong about what you choose. But the key thing is you have to make up your mind about where do I want to play, and make your peace with the trade-offs of that particular choice. So that summarizes the global arena in which we are focusing. And there are definite rules of the game. These rules have been well published as well. And so these are really important things that I think to consider. And then to turn into your own context, because you need to make them work for you. Now we get to the second question that I'd like to ask you today. And this is, what are the new skills that you need to acquire? It may have appeared to you that you don't have all the skills that you actually need. And actually, as we're having this conversation, you know, I'm making notes here, and there are 3 or 4 things here that I'd like to explore in more detail. But I'm sure that you've also identified new skills that you'd like to acquire. So it's now on my watch about 20 past. And why don't you spend the next 10 minutes on having a discussion within your breakaway rooms what are the new skills that you need to acquire to be a global scholar? Toko, how was the chat?
No, it was fine, Prof. Precious will lead us. Thanks.
Okay. And Marty, did you guys find any value in your conversation?
We did, we definitely did. We also saw that we had a lot of overlap into what we would prioritize to achieve our globalization. So that was really, really helpful.
Okay,
but we did
very
nominate
good.
Precious again as our fearless female leader.
Aurelia, I haven't spoken to you today. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, Prof. So I was in the same group as Marty and Tokozani and Precious. But yeah, very insightful, lots of overlap. But yeah, so it's been a good conversation.
Good. And I see actually that the second group was quite large. And the first one where Mengiri was, and Matandu and Sabelo were smaller groups. So I guess you've had a little bit of an opportunity there to get more airtime. So let's go to the smaller group and hear what they had to say. Who's going to speak on your behalf?
Sabelo.
Looking forward, Sabelo.
Well, I'm not sure how I've become the spokesperson of the group, but yeah, it was interesting.
It was interesting. You see, one of the previous observations was on the empowerment of women. But anyway, it's just an observation.
Yeah, I think we should correct that. So we discussed a lot of things. We had a bit more airtime, but I think one of the things that came out was collaborations and international collaborations, because I think some of the people in the group felt that was important. And but what also came up was that building trust, I guess, and collaborations, those are quite challenging things, especially if you're in early career, or at least in this stage, is that you don't know if everyone that you're collaborating with has good intentions and wants to see you progress. And because it happens in some cases that you'll be discussing an idea, the next thing it makes a grant somewhere and you're not part of it. So those are real challenges that I guess each person has to navigate in some ways. The other part of the conversation was around community engagement, because that's some disciplines that becomes important, for example, in economics or development. And that really needs to involve, I mean, if research can involve communities, I think that needs to be developed. But again, it's a skill, right? Because you can't just walk into any community and try to explain your rather complex research to them, but you need to understand how to translate that and how to engage and how you can probably even use your research to help those communities. So I think that cuts across all different disciplines, really. And then the other ones, well, I myself, I've also realized that I'm kind of slightly left behind in technology, and our field is very much moving more towards technology. So I'm spending a 6-month sabbatical in Bristol to try and cover that gap. So it's more on bioinformatics and computer biology or computational biology, because that will essentially help in what I'm doing and probably expand a little bit my research repertoire. And I think that's, yeah, I guess, yeah, everyone had kind of different skill sets that they wanted to achieve, and yeah, and those are the sort of things that came up.
Okay. What I will do is to add a little bit I'll spice my observations with a little bit of partnership dynamics, because I think you've touched on some really, really important elements. Any other observations from the smaller team? So it looks to me as though it sounds as though you've done a great job in summarizing.
Yeah, I think that was a summary of what we
so
tried to
let's go to the big group.
Okay. They asked me to be the representative again. I found our discussion or the skills that we need to require to be in 3 subcategories. So yes, some may be more discipline based, but I'll just summarize them. The first category is one which relates to attracting funds. We indicated that most of us, we have attracted funds mainly from NRF, but we need skills to attract funds externally and also internationally. Then we also indicated that we need to improve on our communication skills in order to be able to form networks. And also from those disciplines which creates basically large data, they need to learn more on the biostatistics, machine learning skills. We also need to learn on skills on fundraising to expand or to increase on our funding, and also to learn to expand on the skills or on the areas that are on other areas within our respective fields in order to expand on our research. Also, okay, the other category, I found it to be the one on learning soft skills, where we said we indicated that we need to have listening skills, adopting, implementing skills, team building skills, and also we need to find ways of communicating, especially with our students, because from students, there's also something that you can learn. So if you spend time interacting with them, as we train them, also find out what is it that they've learned, what is it that they are willing to contribute, then there is something or an idea that you can get from students as well. Then the other part or subcategory, it's the one where we indicated that we need to learn set of skills required for higher leadership positions. We also need to have or attain patents and commercialization skills. Also, we need to train more of PhDs, host more of the postdocs, and we also need to have or attain skills, mentorship skills, and then international funding and collaboration. Yes.
Whoa. Okay, I'm making ample notes here. There we go. This was between the two teams. You've really covered a great deal of very kind of relevant topics here. What is interesting is if I would have to draw an overarching line here, it's all of you in some or other way have focused on trust. And the risk always here is somebody might kind of, take intellectual ownership of your idea, which is actually can be risky. But it kind of brings me back. This is kind of where I think, Sabelo, where I want to add a little bit of stuff about partnership theory. I've kind of put my foot in that trap as well. Or the other thing that could happen is that everybody's very excited at the beginning, everybody's going to do their bit, and then the whole thing just falls flat. So what is really important is when you work with others on a bigger project. So obviously you need to kind of work on more deeper and bigger projects in order to have worldwide impact, global impact. So what is really important is when you choose your partners is that you design the project in such a way that the one project isn't absolutely dependent on the other. Because what you'd like to do is you'd like to compete for a substantial grant. And I would say to build that trust takes about, it doesn't happen overnight. I would go for 3 to 5 years to really develop a point where you had face-to-face interaction, where you really feel that you speak the same kind of language, that there's a commonality in the kind of students that you choose to supervise, that you can build your research area around. Now, imagine the metaphor that I often use there is bridge building. Imagine that you've got one partner on the other side of a cliff and you are standing on this side of the cliff. Now you'd like to build a bridge, which is your project. So that bridge needs to be well anchored on both sides, but the bridge requires two things. It needs to be strong enough, but also wide enough to allow as many of your students to walk over that bridge and be safe. So that for me is a good one. So it normally starts, the first thing that I always try to figure out is what is the big picture here? What is it that we'd like to achieve together? It could be that we have a project in Finland, for example, on the Finnish are kind of are great people in terms of using technology to advance the economy. Polish people, for example, are very determined and they've made huge strides in terms of totally starting with things from the ground upwards, and they still continue to grow. Ethiopia, for example, is a country that has never been colonized, and there's a great deal of lessons to be learned there as well. So the point is, what is the big picture? What is it that you'd like to achieve together with your partners? And it's most likely, a good point is always to have a project where two researchers from two countries collaborate. And I started by choosing not the best people in the world, but people who have a common interest, and you will most likely be more successful with other new emerging scholars. And about a year from then, you should most likely start to be able to tap into the wisdom of more advanced researchers. So once you've got that big picture, then you break it down to who's going to do what and what are the rules of the game. And this is kind of where you already start to sense that kind of thing of interdependence. Now, if you are a young researcher, you are dependent on others. And then you become slightly more independent. You start to do your own thing. And then if you start to tackle the really great things and those big questions, then you realize that we are all interdependent. And this is kind of where that kind of intellectual maturity also kicks in, where you don't worry about, there are thousands of things that you don't know. And the whole idea is to learn as much as possible and to gain depth in your understanding of these projects. And then the interesting thing is that collaborative projects needs to be reviewed quite often. And it obviously depends on the complexity of the project. But I think it's worthwhile if a project, typically in the case of business management and economics and so on, it's about a project of about a year to 18 months. It could be typical grants, international grants, about 2 million Rand. It can go up to 7 million Rand in our field. And then you decide, okay, when are our critical review period? Now, we spend a lot of time planning a grant beforehand. And at this stage, I'd say that about 1 out of 5 grants are successful. But every time you learn a new skill because you apply to a different agency for funding. And what is really worthwhile is within your institution, there should be somebody who's a professional grant writer. At UJ, we have folks who help us to write those grants, to use the right kind of jargon and approach and make sure that we fall in all the blinking forms, the whole thing. And then you do a lot of investment at the beginning in terms of time, and then there should at least be a halfway, again, an investment when the team comes together and review progress. That's now besides the kind of week-to-week interchanges and so on. And then finally, you review it at the end. And the key thing there is just to stand, it's always worthwhile, just to stand back a little bit and ask yourself, what have we learned? What went right? What did we screw up? And then then the cycle of learning is complete and you gain a lot of confidence in so doing. So let's go back to some of Precious and team's comments. Yeah, I've already covered the NRF. NRF is one of our major sources. My concern is sometimes that we are very, very dependent on the NRF for research funding. Whereas we're trying to move on our side a little bit, not away from the NRF, but we'd like to explore more and more other sources of research funding. And obviously in doing so, communication skills are really important. It's always good to have an informal conversation with funders beforehand to hear how they think, so that you know exactly where their core issues are, what is their funding destined for, and then it just helps a lot. I think technical skills are really important, especially a simple thing is like how to use SharePoint if you have to write a joint project. Otherwise, you end up with 500 emails and different documents flying all over the show, and you end up with such a messy business that you've got no cooking clue what's happening. So using SharePoint or other forms of technology is for me almost like sharpening a pencil. It's a basic thing that you have to master. Behavioral skills. Ooh, this is really important. And you know, yesterday, I think, Kirti, the report was on the doctoral review countrywide was released. And in there are several mentions of, well, besides the policy and the structural side of it, on the behavioral element of our doctorates, our doctoral candidates, and that kind of bridging phase into the doctorate, that preliminary phase of registration, and then actually onboarding is the organizational psychology tool for making sure that people get on board and what are the expectations. And then the other thing is, you've mentioned, Precious, you and the team, you refer to mentorship skills. And if I hear the word mentorship, I also ask myself, but what is the difference between a mentor and a coach? Because I see that you've got both in the program. And I think mentorship is when you sometimes more, it's more a kind of a longer term relationship where your responses are more directive in terms of, you know, this is what you need to do, or, you know, consider this and this and this and this. Whereas coaching is more that kind of, this we do at master's level as well, you know, kind of when you instruct your student about how to do things and to get it done. But at the doctoral level, it changes totally. It becomes a coaching process where you lead through the answers that you, through the questions that you ask. And so it's because it's up here. And your student, your candidate, needs to be able to get their own ducks in a row. So, okay, so folks, let me summarize then in brief. The question was, what kind of skills do you need? Interesting for me was that the majority of the skills that you've referred to were interpersonal skills, intrapersonal skills. And so I think you are pretty much, your thoughts are pretty much in line with what is happening. Good. Any further questions that you'd like me to address that maybe is a burning thing in your mind? Okay, so here, interestingly, I'd just like to share some notes with you on career success. Megan told me that she's already mailed you this, so you should have it with you. And there are actually, this comes from conversations that we've had with students who've successfully graduated in minimum time. And the text analysis that we've done on these conversations showed us that our students, and for that matter, upcoming researchers and associate professors and professors, know how to face complexity. And that simply means that you consider all the factors and circumstances. The risks are too high. Don't just dive in. Make sure that you've plotted your career journey very carefully and that you've considered these factors, all the factors and the circumstances influencing it. So if you're an industrial psychologist, you would talk about your drivers and your operating arena. And the interesting thing is to plot this out. I normally plot these things out on an A3 piece of paper or on a flip chart or whatever. And then I fold it up and I keep it, you know. And if we do a halfway review of a project or a student's work or whatever, we go back to this and we continue to make notes on this. And it's amazing how your insight actually deepens. Your overall in the leadership dynamic or the theory and practice of leadership, the more you reflect on complexity, the more you get a grip on it. Otherwise, it becomes something that is alien and strange and causes a lot of anxiety and actually drives your attention away from what needs to be done. Okay, clarity, once again, don't try to do 500 things. What are your top 3 to 5 things that you want to get done? And then it takes some confidence. Believe that it will be a success. I think all of us remember the first day that we delivered a paper at a conference, or we delivered a keynote address, or whatever the case might be. And you kind of need to have a sense that it will be a success. And when I get stuck, even with faculty projects, and you know, sometimes you have to work against the odds even, then I imagine myself selling the idea to a group of people. And I see in my mind's eye my body language, I can hear my voice, or even if I have to lead a difficult meeting at a faculty board or whatever the case might be, you need to believe that it will be a success. Especially if your opponents start to smell fear, then you're probably going to end up being less successful. Creativity means brainstorm solutions to challenges. There's no ways in which you have all the answers to all the questions. And, you know, as Sabelo has said, you know, trust takes a long time. But hell knows, guys, you will rely on a few people, let's say by the end of your academic life, and about 5 really good colleagues. And it's always worthwhile to check your ideas and to discuss it so that you can get more solutions than just your own. Commitment, get the job done. End of story. Consolidation means that as you grow, you will move on. And that means that you also need to stop doing some things. I think in any strategy, a key success driver is to know what to stop doing. So in a couple of years from now, the things that you will be doing will most likely be different than today. And some things you have to stop doing. Well, you need to figure that one out. And that again is part of coaching. Change, live out the change process, life happens, and that's it. So some notes on career innovation. Now the next thing is resources that you require. Are there any other, we spoke about time, we spoke about funding, but what do you think are the key resources? The key, can you identify 3 things in your group that you will be utterly dependent on to achieve success? And let's make this a quick one. Let's break away and then we will come together again at 11:05. How does that sound? Okay, folks. So we've discussed the global environment, the rules of the game in that particular operating arena. We've discussed the skills that you require, but now you need to use those skills and use specific things to get the job done. What are those top 3 resources that you need in your minds? Let's hear. And I hope that this time we'll be able to have women speaking on behalf of the groups. Ooh, total quiet, total silence.
Matabo
right.
was, okay, go Jeremiah.
You know why I was laughing?
Okay, in
you know, Jeremiah, for a woman, you've got a very kind of a deep voice.
No, let's give it to Matabo first, because when you say a woman first, I was about to be on the platform.
Okay, Martha, over to you.
Yeah.
Okay. So in our group, one of the needs was mentoring in terms of accessing high impact journals and being able to identify quality students for supervision, and being in terms of successfully sourcing grants. There's someone who's not muted. Okay, so getting grants and quality students and accessing high impact journals. Those were the 3 that were discussed by almost everyone in group 2. Thank you.
That certainly rings a bell to me. Okay, so let's go to the second group.
Right. Although I'm not a woman, let me go first on behalf of the other group. But maybe before I mention the 3 things that I think are important as far as the group is concerned, I must highlight that really our session was very interesting. Great minds always think alike. And I think with
there's a second part to that saying, huh?
Sorry?
I think that saying has a second part to it. Besides, great minds always think alike.
I'm interested on the second part.
The rest of the saying goes, great minds think alike and fools seldom differ.
Okay, our focus, that's why it's on the first part.
Right. Excellent.
Yes, I think the one that really it's top of the list from our group is a meaningful funding. We all agree that in terms of the resources we need, really top of that is we need to have the meaningful funding for us to be successful in our research career trajectories. Also said mentorship, and I think which is also came from the other group as well. So we see the importance of the mentorship, but also we said we need students to really become successful. In some areas, we also need laboratory infrastructure. So meaning equipment, analytical equipment. So I think those are the top 3 things that from our group, we really felt that are very crucial for us to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Jeremiah, just for the sake of interest, what is your discipline?
I'm in chemistry.
Okay, that explains the infrastructure.
Yes.
That explains the infrastructure story. Yeah, okay, so I think the first point that I think that it's interesting that kind of all of you have focused on the same things, and I'll try to combine them. Let's go about the students that we attract. At this stage, my key concern is about throughput, and especially at the doctoral level. And one thing that we've learned is less is more. Now, you see, this kind of thing contrasts now with what a university normally wants, because we get about 16 times the subsidy compared for a doctoral candidate. You need about, it's equivalent to 16 undergrad students. So, and then it's the teaching output as well is substantially more. So the key thing is whatever you take in, you need to kind of make sure that you kind of, that they need to graduate as well. So this is now where I think the doctoral review that I've just referred to from the CHE that was released yesterday also speaks to this particular point, and the level of preparedness of doctoral candidates before they really hit the top. And if there's a lot of writing skills as well required, because it's actually a whole new advanced way of putting your thoughts over. And that's kind of where writing schools come in, for example, which are normally conducted at the university level, what could be done at a faculty level, depending on how your organization operates. But what is also important is opportunities for PhD students to come together, because the PhD journey can be very, very lonely. And sometimes you end up feeling very sorry for yourself and you lose interest. But if you meet with others who are in a similar position, in terms of work stuff, life stuff, family stuff, you name it, it becomes easier, and then you don't feel that alone. So there's definitely for me a crafting, a skills component attached to our students to prepare them for the doctoral journey, but there's also an emotional support way. And sometimes it's just about getting together. Interestingly, what we've learned here at UJ is that our doctoral students need to see each other at least once a semester. That's a good guideline. And you don't have to have an elaborate thing. It's just about getting together for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and just to have an informal chat. And we just call them curry and rice sessions. And that's kind of where we invite our doctorates. There are plates, there's a basic dish. We make sure that it meets all dietary requirements, and there's an opportunity to chat. It's as simple as that. And what is then also nice is that as supervisors, we mingle with our students and we pick up all kinds of interesting things in which we follow up. So that's kind of taking care of our students. But then we also need to take care of our supervisors. Because I think if I would have to supervise now, the way that I supervised 5 years ago, I would probably be useless. This is also a skill that continuously evolves. And mentoring, Martha, you mentioned mentoring at the very top of your list. It never stops. A mentor is a wise person that you speak to who can guide you. It comes from the old Greek mythology. And it's important to talk to people who have already supervised a lot and who are currently supervising, just to always refresh your skills. And it's good to every 2 or 3 years attend a workshop just to brush up on new methodologies or new ways of teaching and supervising coming through, because we carry a much higher load than ever before. But the key thing is, folks, please don't overload yourself with too many doctorates. Then you are going to burn your fingers at some stage. And it varies. Maybe you just do research and you've got a chair, then it's fine. But otherwise, it could be scary. Was it Matabo? I see your hand is up.
Yes, Prof. I wanted to find out from your perspective, do you think these days academic institutions are moving towards creating conducive environments for collaboration? because with promotions and everyone fighting to get ahead, then that is not a conducive environment for collaboration in many instances. And working transdisciplinarily, interdisciplinarily, and so forth. What's your take on that?
My take is that in the long run, you'll fight each other so much that you forget to focus on the bigger picture. So what is really important in facilitating a team in a department, a faculty, or in an institution is to really, what you do is, in terms of your behavior, you reward the behavior by your presence. To give you a very practical example, I would, if an individual performs well, then you acknowledge the individual at individual level. If the team performs well, then you acknowledge the team. Otherwise, money and information could become currencies of conflict. So I think it's interesting thing. I'm trying to figure now out that people compete in terms of promotion. Well, the fact of the matter is, you've tried to be a prima donna on your own and push others out of the way, it's likely that you're not going to achieve the big goal very soon. That's my take on it. I hope that kind of gives you a very straightforward answer.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it sounds as though there was a bit of humor in there, but I don't beat around the bush with this stuff. And the key thing is, when it comes to promotion, if you work in a decent faculty, your faculty would have recognized your talent and kind of had a conversation with you about what your aspirations are, and exactly the same kind of conversation that we're having now. So, okay, what are the things, what is the big picture? Where are you going to play in the global kind of environment, in the African environment, our continent, our country? And then I would kind of, now I know exactly what all the academics are doing in our faculty. And then I would bring people together and say, hey, but Paul, you've never met Chris. Why don't we have a cup of coffee, or just walk to me to the offices? And that's kind of how you start to build those bridges that I've referred to earlier. And then you kind of create this thing, well, you know what, the faculty as a whole is moving ahead. And then the departments don't want to stay behind. And then the people in the departments don't want to stay behind. And then the whole thing starts to gain momentum. Okay, now I'm starting to sound like a pastor, don't I? Okay, so folks, we've covered the grants thing as well. Matabu? Oh, okay, so you're clapping. It's either clapping hands or praying, but let's hope it's clapping hands. So let's go to the last part of our conversation today. There's one thing that I always look for, and this is innovation. Now, folks, I've never really been able to define innovation, but I realize when I see it. I know it when I see it. And I think there are three things in there. There's always creativity. And this is especially the case in terms of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work. There's a basic ability to understand technology and how to use it. So you don't have to know, if you're not an expert in blockchain, you don't have to understand what happens behind the scenes, but it's like your cell phone. I think you know how to use this thing and your touch screen, but you don't know what the inside, how it works. But you need to understand what are the technologies that you need to master and be able to use. Like your statistical techniques, R's, SPSS, Lexi Mansa, Atlas TI, you name it, you would know what you need. And I think the guys in chemistry are probably even more, because they speak languages that I just can't follow. And then scaling up, you always start with a small idea and then you scale it up. Imagine a seedling, a seed that you plant, and then you scale it up and grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And if the seed doesn't germinate the first time or the second time, maybe it's time for another seed. but the environment in which you grow that seed is also incredibly important, and your university's attitude and drive towards success. Okay, so I think I spoke about this earlier today, and you've also mentioned it. Handling fear and being on the conservative side. Now, academics generally don't like to take risks. So I think what is still important, think ahead, think about your grand idea, but especially when you get out of the starting blocks, think about how you will play it safe. And if you feel that you are getting disappointed with yourself and that you are starting to doubt yourself, figure out where do these feelings come from. Because a feeling is linked to an emotion, which is a longer term thing, and then you need to steer away from toxic situations. So Martha, you've mentioned some people who can't see beyond their door. Those are the kind of people that you steer away from. Work with people that gives you joy. Well, that's kind of what I've learned over the past 30 years, for that matter. Okay, now here's our last question for the day, guys. In essence, what we spoke about today, if I would have to summarize this in a nutshell, are three things. It is the importance of being reflective. And this is why you have all these breakaway sessions and when you started the conversation. And I do hope that you will continue this conversation so that when we meet each other in person one day, perhaps, that you'll be able to say, okay, well, how have I progressed? So the first one is being reflective. It's really a self-evaluation of your long-term career goals. It starts with yourself. What's your bigger picture? Where are you now? What are the big steps that you'd like to take, the 3 or 5? What kind of resources do you need? How are you going to monitor and evaluate yourself? And then what is also important is to compare yourself to other professors and associate professors who recently got promoted. And there's nothing wrong if you see in your institutional grants, you should get a monthly report, at least on seeing who got what. Then find out, why were they successful? Walk over to the office and say, hey man, Prof, can I speak to you a moment? I just want to understand, congratulations on your fantastic grant. And wow, how did you get that done? And you always find that the more people know, the more they're willing to share with you. It's normally the ones that are not that good, that are full of nonsense. So, and then what are your universities and faculty and departments' expectations of you? If you don't know, then you don't know where to start. You always work in an operating context and you need to understand that. So that requires reflection. Now, the second thing is communication skills. So information is not going to come to you. You don't put an article under your pillow and then the next morning you'll know how the whole thing works. So you need to actively seek information to ensure a great plan. And then you also need to figure out who are the people that you need along the road. And then they're called your stakeholders. The stakeholder is anybody who's affected by your decisions and from whom you can get support. The last one is behavioral. So we spoke about goal setting and strategy. And defining strategy or conceptualizing a strategy is one thing. It takes one hell of a lot of courage to make it work. So that's where behavior kicks in. And if you feel that you stumble and that you're falling, then you kind of figure out why is that and where does it come from. So also create awareness of your ambitions. If your HOD, your program manager, your dean, whatever, whoever doesn't know about what you want to get done, how are you going to gain resources? You always sell an idea first and then you put it on paper. So paper is a very cold thing. Humans are warmer and they can talk to each other. So create that awareness without being known as somebody who just sucks up all the time and doesn't deliver any results. Obviously, new skills. We spoke about that extensively today. And then the big C, collaboration. So folks, in conclusion, I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and I want to have each member of your team break away and tell me, and they can tell us, where do you think are you currently? Are you practicing all 3 of these things, cyclical because they never stop? Or where do you find yourselves now predominantly? 2 minutes. Good. So folks, this was a quick one, wasn't it? So this is kind of a summary of everything that we've discussed this morning over the last, well, 2.5 hours almost. So where do you stand? Just give me feedback randomly.
Prof, this is Aurelia. Yeah, this was a quick one. We didn't all get to speak on that, but I guess people can jump in. So what I said, although I think I do a little bit of everything, I think one of the things that I really focus on is the reflection part of it. And I think I mentioned previously in one of the sessions that I think I'm pretty confident, but I do sometimes have this inner voice that tends to doubt Aurelia. And so I always try and think as to, or I'm conscious about thinking as to what happened, what has triggered that. So there must have been some event that has happened that causes me to pause at times and doubt myself. So yeah.
Aurelia, I can guarantee you, you are not alone there. I also sometimes doubt myself, and then I have to kind of figure out now, where on earth does this come from? Okay, next feedback. Who would like to take a go?
For me, Prof, it's Matabo here.
Yes, Matabo.
My biggest problem is I'm very harsh on myself. So I think on the reflective side, I'm always thinking, yes, I've done well, but is that good enough? And I always believe the best that I've done is not the best that I could have provided. So I keep on thinking, how can I make it better than how it was? And that ends in my way because sometimes it gets me to procrastinate in terms of figure out how to make it better, if that makes sense.
It does make sense to me, because I think the human dynamic here is that if you get anxious, then you feel that you're not good enough. Actually, the feeling that you're not good enough leads to anxiety, and eventually it's very difficult for you to make up your mind because you go into survival mode, which leads to procrastination. So if I was your coach, I would probably have asked you, well, tell me more about how you award yourself. So first of all, let me briefly summarize, because I've asked you for 2.5 hours, and my word, we spent 2.5 hours together. So we started with your positioning in the bigger global environment. We focused on the big C, which is collaboration. Then we focused on, if you want to collaborate, you can't compete with existing skills. You actually have to have more skills that you can align towards your bigger picture. And then the next one is, what kind of resources do you need? And we've had, I actually would have preferred to have a little bit of a longer discussion on the last one. But it's I think one thing that I've sensed in the previous group as well is that it's a cyclical process. It's never static. And the reflection part is pretty important, because in pure strategy, it's part of that monitoring and evaluation phase. So I'm watching what's happening in the chat. And yeah, well, actually you can say Daneel, same here as well. So, and I think this is the magic, you know, we do so much research and great work. And sometimes we are kind of conditioned by our discipline to stand outside our data. And as a leading researcher or an academic leader, you sometimes need to step out of it into your data, which is not a field that many of our disciplines are familiar with. So on this note, Kirti and Bernadette, I'd like to say thank you very much for wonderful conversations that we've had over the last, well, the first session and today, and with the other group yesterday or on Monday. And I would like to wish you a pleasant break, if at all. And may you be blessed with lots and lots of electricity and warmth, and stay safe. And I hope that I will be able to see you and meet you in person as we go along.
Thank you very, very much, Daneel. I think everyone has deeply appreciated these sessions, and there's been quite a lot of very frank sharing as we continue on this exploring of this journey of our FPPs. So on behalf of the team, I'd like to thank you very, very much. To my FPPs, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I share Daneel's sentiment and wishes. I hope that translates into action. I don't think I can deal with any more stages of electricity shedding, but have a wonderful day. And for those of you who are taking a bit of a break, please do restore your energy. And if you succeed in restoring your energy, do give us the recipe. But have a wonderful day. Daneel, thank you so much. We've always benefited from your wisdom, and thank you. Have a
Power
good
to the
day, everyone.
professors. Power to the professors.
Thanks, Daneel.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.